Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and today I have another Uzair with me joining for this conversation. Joining me is Uzair Aqeel. He has over 15 years of experience on the international debt market side. And so I figured we'll have somebody like him join us for this conversation because obviously, if you've been tuning into this podcast or reading the papers about Pakistan's economy, debt is a big issue. Does Pakistan need debt restructuring? Can it pay its debt? Is it going to default? What's the credit default swap on Pakistani euro bonds? Everyone's kind of become an expert on this lingo around debt that, maybe even 6 months ago, it was a very select group of people in the financial services industry who kind of followed and understood nitty gritty about what's going on in a market like Pakistan or just broadly around the global economy related to debt. So I figured today we have this conversation with Uzair primarily because he's been on the market side of this conversation. His team has raised billions of dollars in debt for emerging market borrowers, including stressed sovereigns like Ukraine, Egypt, and Argentina. So he kind of understands the issues and the problems, both market side people, but also sovereign entities face in a debt crisis. And currently, he's serving as managing partner of Nairang Capital, which is a private markets investor focused on emerging and frontier market. So, Uzair, welcome to Pakistonomy. Always good to have another Uzair on the show.
Yeah,
And thank
thank
you
you,
for taking
Uzair.
out the time.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
So I want to begin with this fundamental question I've been, grappling with, and I think a lot of us have been dealing with in the public domain, which is what are Pakistan's debt repayment obligations on the external side, both in
Yeah,
terms of near term and medium term and long term. And of course, there has been some level of confusion because people read one figure a certain way, then it goes on social media. The finance minister says something. You're one of the experts. Tell us about what are the
sure.
obligations for the country in 2023 and how does the country find a way to pay all of these obligations?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question because a lot of the information we need is not necessarily up to date in the public domain. So, as we were discussing before the call started, the three sources of data everybody relies on are basically the state banks, published economic data, the Ministry of Finance's medium term debt strategy and policy statement, as well as the periodic updates that they provide. And then, most importantly, the IMF docs, as and when there's a review or an Article 4 or something is published that provides updates from the external perspective, which kind of ties in all of the different sources of information. So the most reliable information, in my view, is probably the information we get out of the IMF, because it provides a holistic view. And just based on that, the top line figure for external financing requirement is for the fiscal year 23, just under $31 billion. That's as of the IMF data published last year in September
And that
when
fiscal
they were
year
doing the
ends in
seventh and eighth
June.
reviews.
June 2023 is when Pakistan's fiscal year ends.
Correct. Correct. So this is July to June 23. The requirement is about 31 billion. Next year, next fiscal year, it'll rise to 37, and then it'll come down a little bit, but sort of stays in the 35 to $40 billion a year range for the foreseeable future. And by foreseeable future, I mean out to fiscal year 27, which is as far as the IMF has published so far. So for the year 2023, again, the numbers fluctuate a lot, particularly with all the things that are going on with respect to the foreign exchange rate, and also the additional government policies that are constantly being introduced, which have compressed imports, and created some other short-term effects as well. The most up-to-date information that we've received from the Ministry of Finance was earlier this week, where they said that in the negotiations with the IMF, currently the projection is $7 billion to the end of this fiscal year. साथ में उन्होंने ये भी कह दिया कि है 7 billion, लेकिन उसके साथ साथ we expect that it'll be reduced by 1 billion because we're continuing to crimp imports, which on the one hand will affect the current account deficit, but also on the other hand, increases or leaves some more money in your foreign reserves kitty. तो उस basis पे वो कह रहे हैं कि $1 billion कम करके you need basically $6 billion to the end of this fiscal year. उसी article में साथ के साथ इसाक डार की एक additional statement आई where he said actually he thinks it's $5 billion. So, take that as your range, somewhere between 5 and 7 billion, with risk to the upside, because over the course of this fiscal year so far, that's the direction that revisions have gone. In terms of how that'll be managed, I mean, fingers crossed, inshallah, this IMF tranche comes through. That's 1.2 billion. But then on top of that, you have all of the commitments made by bilateral creditors and multilateral creditors since last year, which haven't really materialized because the IMF review has been stuck. That amounts to something like, somewhere between $4 and $6 billion coming from the likes of Saudi, UAE, China, of course, Qatar. Not necessarily new capital, but finally agreeing to refinance some of the loans, some amend and extends, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's interesting. On the Chinese side, we've already also heard the finance minister say that, there's a $1.5 billion loan, 700 million, I think, or close to a billion has been received. Another 500 million, he said, is in the works. The paperwork has been done, apparently, right? And the point you made on the, on the imports compression side is super interesting because, again, I try to explain this to the layperson audience in terms of what's going on here. The perfect analogy for that is कि आपके घर के अंदर जो है वो पैसे कम हैं, तो आप कह रहे हैं मैं बचत करूंगा किस तरह, अपनी बच्चियों को स्कूल से निकाल के, या घर पे जो है 2 रोटी की बजाय 1 रोटी खा के. So the import compression technically sounds very okay, but it basically is leading to all sorts of supply chain issues across the economy, which are having a disastrous impact on the broader macroeconomic picture in the country.
Yeah, Uzair, I just like to pause and make 2 points here, right? The first is it's very important that we have good data to work off. And unfortunately, a lot of the information we get is from offhand remarks made by dignitaries or, officials. And जैसे ये जो डार साहब ने जो कहा था कि 1.5 billion agree हो गया है, that has been double counted, I feel, because now this $500 million tranche that he talks about, कि उसकी documentation हो गई और वो आने वाले, that's actually part of the same facility. And that was replacing an existing facility. So we need to be very careful about what's like new capital coming into the country and what's just basically being rolled over or refinanced.
So let's very quickly clarify this, because now I'm also a bit confused, and thank you for pointing this out. The $5 to $7 billion range that's there, that basically is new financing that the country needs. So
no, that actually includes rollovers as well.
It includes rollovers. Okay.
Yeah, because also, not just rollovers, but there's amortizations constantly in the long-term multilateral financings that we have. So those are like 20, 21-year financings, and they constantly step down. So there's a small principal repayment every year, which is what's referred to as an amortization. So वो भी उसमें included है, कुछ rollovers of bilateral facilities, वो भी उसमें included है. That's the total amount required. But then when we talk about कि क्या achieve हो चुका है, and I think the recent announcements by China are a sea change, by the way. The 1.5 plus the 700. But it's important that 1.5 and 700 isn't recycled so many times in the sound bites that people assume that actually we're making more progress than we actually are.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. And we'll get back to the good data point, right? Because that, again, I think for you and for me and many others who've been watching this for a number of months now, at least I've been asking privately in private conversations, can you share with me a table that at least gives me a month by month breakdown of how much you're going to be paying in amortization, in interest, with rollovers coming in, so that we have a time-bound picture, right? A country that has about $3 to $4 billion in reserves, you can't say, okay, we have this obligation 6 months down the road, because the issue is not going to be just solvency. It's going to be liquidity in the near term, and that table isn't there, but we'll get to that.
That's absolutely right.
The other question was there that's been obviously going around. Tabadla did a conversation with the former acting governor and the former deputy governor of the State Bank. Murtaza Sayyed was there. Main Rahman was there. Khurram Hussain was there. Musharraf was hosting that conversation, which was this broader debate on, well, do we need debt restructuring or not? And that's been ongoing, right? Murtaza Sayyed has been in the papers talking about, yes, that's the case. You gave the numbers, about 35 billion or so roughly every fiscal year is the payment obligation. Quite a few people have been saying, the Prime Minister met a team from Rothschild, which are specialists on the debt restructuring side.
Absolutely.
What's your take as somebody who's been on the market side and who's knee deep into this data and what Pakistan's obligations are? Does
Yeah.
Pakistan need debt restructuring or not?
Look, I think I have a strong view on whether we need restructuring right now. That's a very different statement on, from whether we need restructuring over a certain period of time or whether we will ever need restructuring. At the current point, we don't need restructuring, or rather, we cannot restructure. And the reasons for that are simple. You don't restructure at the height of a crisis unless you absolutely have to. The IMF is providing a way out of this crisis. And we must take that path, however painful it is, we must take that path for fear of ending up in a situation which is significantly worse. Um, and once that crisis, the immediate crisis is passed, we can consider our best options. अभी जो है जो सुबह में जो हेडलाइन आई थी कि पाकिस्तानी बॉन्ड जो 24 वाला जो बॉन्ड है उसकी यील्ड 106% हो गई है. Of course, discard the hyperbole in that, but the fundamental point is the market is not receptive to emerging markets, and particularly triple C rated emerging markets like Pakistan is, raising large amounts of capital without having very clear plans on how they're going to repay it. In my conversations with fund managers, many of whom I used to cover as clients previously, many of whom I used to have daily conversations with, Pakistan is gradually falling behind even its peers in emerging markets in terms of its desirability as a venue for investment. वो कहते हैं कि हम आपको पैसा भी ₹1 भी देंगे तो आप ये नहीं बता सकते कि आप वापस किस तरह करेंगे. It's that robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of situation that we're in. So we need to stop getting away from the core issue. And that core issue is that we need to have a real plan which involves fiscal rationalization, increasing revenues, decreasing expenditures, going away from subsidies which are counterproductive to the medium-term, prosperity of the country, and finding a real way out of this rather than just keeping the party going. अच्छा, अगर आप historically देखें तो Pakistan has gone through restructuring multiple times. Typically not on a large scale basis.
Musharraf के ज़माने में last big one I remember after
exactly 9/11. That was the big one, yeah. उससे पहले भी होती रही है, 2-3 दफा हुई है. लेकिन I'd love to hear anyone argue that actually did us any kind of structural good, because the bad habits that we've fallen into is कि इससे पहले कि उसका कोई फायदा है restructuring का, पहले ही subsidies, tariff reductions, distortions को promote करने लगते हैं लोग. अच्छा, ये जो इस हफ्ते जो आर्टिकल आया था जिसमें डिस्कस कर रहे थे कि फाइनेंसिंग नीड 7 billion होंगी या 6 billion होंगी, one of the headline items in that was that the PM would like to introduce a subsidy for motorcycle riders for petrol. साथ के साथ he would also like to introduce a subsidy for wheat for Islamabad. So ये जो है, you can't be on the one hand begging the IMF to accept your promises that you will make changes, and even before they've agreed, start planning कि आप किस तरह से additional subsidies apply करेंगे. This is a behavioral pattern that we need to break away from. And until we do, any benefits of restructuring will just be frittered away. अच्छा, एक point मैं और कहूँगा कि restructuring जो है, generally speaking as well in emerging markets, has not been the panacea that people imagine that it is.
Before you elaborate, I'm sorry to interrupt, why it's not the panacea. I can imagine a lot of people listening in who are like, ये होती क्या है, process क्या है इसका और इसका impact क्या होता है. First, before you go, why it doesn't work, and you explained like you need structural reforms, which I understand, and a lot of the more sophisticated people who follow these patterns around the world understand it. But help the average citizen of Pakistan who's now hearing a lot about debt in Pakistan.
Sure.
Restructuring होती क्या है?
It's a good point, and if you don't mind, I'll just back up a little bit even more. ये बहुत सारे loves जो हैं, they're being thrown out at the moment. एक तरफ default है, दूसरी तरफ moratorium है, तीसरी तरफ restructuring है, चौथी तरफ reprofiling है. Or literally over the last 6 months, a lot of lay people have been making elaborate comments on this without necessarily understanding the implications of all of these. So it's important to separate them all out. A default is the nuclear option. A default is where you say मैं पैसे नहीं दे रहा, कर लो जो करना. And that has immediate implications क्योंकि आपकी जो सारी external credit lines हैं, they immediately get pulled. जिस तरह श्रीलंका के साथ हुआ था, that means कि आपके पास ना fuel होगा, ना बिजली होगी, medicines को import करना मुश्किल होगा, दालें नहीं आएंगी, cooking oil कहाँ से आप लाएंगे? And that leads to political and social serious issues. That also means that the economy, of course, gets disrupted. जिससे और आपका नुकसान होता है. And finally, it means that when you come out of the crisis, you end up bearing higher borrowing costs sort of indefinitely.
और एक और
So,
चीज मैं ऐड कर दूं क्योंकि लोग इस पे
yeah.
बहुत फोकस करते हैं पाकिस्तान में, rightfully so, because we have a lot of imports and imported inflation, which is your exchange rate basically collapses
Oh,
in the event of a
absolutely.
default.
Absolutely. अभी लोग बिलबिला रहे हैं कि जी 50%, 70% गिरा है आपका रुपी. It'll go to 500 in a heartbeat if we actually default, and it'll go beyond that in the future. This is a very dangerous word to throw around, and when I see politicians, senior politicians saying that Mulk is already defaulted, so this is a very, very dangerous statement to be putting out there, and people should really refrain from doing that. अच्छा, डिफॉल्ट के भी मल्टीपल तरीके होते हैं, क्योंकि आपके पास बहुत सारे यहाँ पे क्रेडिटर्स हैं, आपके कुछ ऑफिशियल क्रेडिटर्स हैं, कुछ प्राइवेट क्रेडिटर्स हैं, कुछ बॉन्ड्स हैं. तो कई इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स में आप सिलेक्टिव डिफॉल्ट कर सकते हैं कि आपने एक क्रेडिटर से डिफॉल्ट कर दिया. लेकिन जो खतरा होता है वो ये होता है कि अक्सर इन फैसिलिटीज में अब क्रॉस डिफॉल्ट की प्रोविजन होती हैं. तो आपने इस पे डिफॉल्ट किया, वो जो बाकी सारी भी जो आपकी डेट फैसिलिटीज हैं वो भी डिफॉल्ट हो गई
तो
साथ के
यानी
साथ.
कि आप कह रहे हैं कि मालिक मकान को रेंट नहीं दे रहा, गाड़ी की पेमेंट कर देता
के
हूँ और
इलेक्ट्रिक ने
बच्चों
बिजली
के,
काट दी.
हाँ
हाँ,
तो बट द
क्योंकि
बैंक
आपने
दैट्स
रेंट नहीं.
बोरोइंग अक्रॉस द बोर्ड दे आर ऑल द सेम. सो वो अगर आपके इलेक्ट्रिक को नहीं देंगे और उनको पता लग गया कि इधर इसने
बिल्कुल.
बिल पे डिफॉल्ट कर दिया या मालिक मकान को नहीं दे रहा, तो essentially in the
बिल्कुल.
US this happens, right? Your credit score collapses and all other
Exactly.
lines of credit become very expensive for you.
Precisely. So, and by the way, we'll get to this later, but that's one of the important reasons why you have to have a really clear picture कि आपकी liabilities हैं, कि आपकी debts हैं, क्या किसको हैं, क्या potential situations arise कर सकती हैं. So default should be ruled out of everyone's picture because it creates these unintended consequences जो आप analyze नहीं कर सकते, जो आप समझ नहीं सकते. और अगर आप अभी ये जैसे रेको दिक वाला जो मसला हुआ था और अभी जो ईरान की पाइपलाइन वाला जो मसला पैदा हो रहा है, these are all examples of unintended consequences that can really just take the small benefit you gain from default and turn it into a massive negative. अच्छा, फिर आता है repudiation or moratorium. Repudiation is when you simply walk away from your debt. You know, not only do you not pay your debt, you say that this debt no longer exists. I think that's really rare, and that's something that's happened maybe a couple of times. I think Cuba did it, maybe Russia did it once as well,
बंदा
but
मार्केट
it's
से भाग
rare.
गया बेसिकली.
हाँ, and then you can imagine उसके बाद आपको कोई नहीं पैसा देगा, कभी भी नहीं देगा. तीसरी होती है जी moratorium, which is where you say कि जी we're going to pause payments until we have had a conversation with our creditors to say हमारी ये situation है, हम इस मुसीबत में फंसे हैं, आप हमारी मदद करें. तो जब ये करते हैं moratorium या repudiation या default, either of these three processes will ultimately lead to a restructuring conversation, which is where you sit down with all of your different creditors, either individually या सब साथ बैठ जाते हैं कमरे में, और सबकी अलग अलग इंटरेस्ट होती हैं. बाय द वे, किसी ने अपने फैसिलिटीज सिक्योर की हुई होती हैं आपकी प्रॉपर्टी पे, किसी की अनसिक्योर्ड होती हैं फैसिलिटीज वगैरह वगैरह, और आप बैठ के उनसे डिस्कस.
एक एग्जांपल मैं दे दूं अगेन बिकॉज दिस वाज इन द मीडिया अ व्हाइल
या
अगो. हेडलाइंस चलती थी, पाकिस्तान हैज रेज्ड $1 billion फ्रॉम सुकूक इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स और हाईवे गिरवी रखवा दिए. So that was, you were
या
referring
या
as collateral associated with some debt
That's
like that.
collateral associated, yeah. Slightly different case, but yeah, that's exactly right. और वैसे वही जो अगर हम एग्जांपल है कि आप इंडिविजुअल हैं, आपने डिफॉल्ट किया तो बैंक आके आपकी गाड़ी छीन ले या आपको घर से बाहर निकाल दिए, वो वाली सिचुएशंस अराइज कर सकती
M2
हैं. और
मोटरवे तो नहीं लिया जा सकता लेकिन
that's why I said it was slightly different. वो मोटरवे आपसे छीन नहीं सकते, लेकिन आप एग्जांपल लें कि जब अर्जेंटीना ने डिफॉल्ट किया था, and that was a proper default back in 2005. I mean, they've defaulted 9 or 11 times. But when they defaulted in 2005, that led to a process that lasted 10 years. और उसमें बड़ी मशहूर ये केस है कि उनकी एक शिप जो थी वो इंटरनेशनल वाटर्स में थी. हेज फंड्स एलियट और एनएमएल जो हेज फंड्स थे वो उस पर चढ़ गए कि जी ये अब हमारी हो गई है. And you can imagine the kind of embarrassment that causes and the kind of implications that can have if it's something bringing you LNG or if it's green or whatever it is. तो डिफॉल्ट शुड
पता
नेवर
चला
एवर बी.
वजीर आजम साहब पीआईए के प्लेन में न्यूयॉर्क उतरे और उनका प्लेन ही रख लिया किसी ने कि जी ये तो
हो
नहीं
सकता
जाने
है,
दे रहे आपको. हो सकता है, हम
बिल्कुल हो सकता
मजाकिया
है.
बात कर रहे हैं, बट
रोजवेल्ट,
दैट्स द फॉल आउट. रोजवेल्ट
या
होटल है.
रोजवेल्ट होटल पे हमने कब्जा कर लिया, आप क्या करेंगे. पाकिस्तान की जबरदस्त एम्बेसी जो है नाइट्सब्रिज में लंदन में, it's worth 100 million pounds. What if they just take that over? These kinds of things can happen. And by the way, it's not just that they barge through the doors and take it over. They go to court, they file an appeal, saying कि इनके इन assets को आप freeze करें, bank accounts को freeze किया जा सकता है, तो आपकी जो foreign exchange है उसको freeze किया जा सकता है. It's a very dangerous situation. अच्छा, जब restructuring होती है तो आमतौर पे फिर आप बैठ के creditors को present करते हैं कि जी ये मसला है, this is how we got here, we recognize there's a problem, we need this kind of relief. When you say you need this kind of relief, you also need to provide a plan. And that plan says कि हम ये steps लेंगे to rectify the situation, और उसके basis पे हमारा इतना gap रह जाएगा, तो आप उस gap को relief के तौर पे हमें provide कर दें. अच्छा, फिर जो है creditors ultimately can be quite difficult about it, particularly in the current macro environment. तो जैसे अभी गाना की जो restructuring हुई थी, तो उसमें they insisted कि domestic creditors must also take a loss, which ended up meaning that the restructuring process there took an extra 6 or 8 months because they had to convince their local creditors, pension funds, banks, etc., to take losses, which is of course very painful. Or फिर ultimately out of that, there will be an agreement कि जी ये restructured securities will replace the existing securities. Typically, either there's a haircut where they say, okay, you owe us $100, but now we'll reduce that to 60. You just have to repay a 60 and you pay interest on the 60 as well. तो आपकी काफी कम हो जाती है debt servicing cost. वरना दूसरा तरीका, which is more common, is कि आप net present value loss creditors को दे देते हैं. आप जो है डेट की मेच्योरिटी एक्सटेंड कर देते हैं और आप इसका कूपन जो है शायद जरा सा कम कर दें, तो उसकी बेसिस पे आपका जो डेट स्टॉक है उसकी नेट प्रेजेंट वैल्यू कम हो जाती है और डेट सर्विस की भी रिलीफ मिल जाती है. द एग्जैक्ट type of restructuring that happens depends on how flexible the creditors are, what the needs of the country are vis-a-vis debt servicing versus just reducing the debt stock, etc., etc. तो इसमें जो सबसे बड़ा जो मसला पेश आता है आमतौर पे वो ये होता है कि आपके कई किस्म के क्रेडिटर्स होते हैं. एक तरफ आपके मल्टीलैटरल बैंक्स होते हैं, दूसरी तरफ आपकी कंट्रीज होती हैं, तीसरी तरफ आपके प्राइवेट क्रेडिटर्स होते हैं जिनमें कमर्शियल बैंक्स भी होते हैं और बॉन्ड होल्डर्स भी होते हैं, और सबके अलग अलग ऑब्जेक्टिव्स होते हैं. The bondholders will always be pushing for the highest net present value and the highest kind of return that they can achieve. The multilaterals will be looking to kind of help you with your debt relief requirements, etc., etc. सबके अलग अलग objectives होते हैं. तो इसके लिए इसको recognize करते हुए कि ये मसला पेश आने वाला है और सब emerging markets को पेश आएगा, the G20 came up with what's known as the common framework. So during COVID, they came up with something called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI. जो हमने भी इसका फायदा उठाया था. We were one of the first countries to go for it.
And for those who don't know, G20 is the group of the largest 20 economies of the world.
Right. And kind of unofficially led by the US, of course, but bringing together the UK, France, Japan, etc. और ये इन्होंने a common framework set up किया था, recognizing the fact that the biggest challenge is going to be achieving consensus. So we'll just get all creditors in the room together under this framework, and everyone will try to achieve the same sort of result. That'll be official creditors. And then private creditors के लिए, the borrowing country who's appealing for debt relief will have to try to achieve the same terms with private creditors as well. That framework has been, I'm sorry to say, a complete failure. Several countries have applied for it, but to my knowledge, only Chad has actually managed to get debt relief out of it. Chad is a country in Africa.
Yeah, and I think abhi jab G20 ki finance ministers meeting India mein ho rahi thi, so even the Indians put out a statement seeking reforms to this. The Chinese and the US obviously have been at loggerheads over a lot of this issue as well.
That's it.
So it's becoming geopolitical, but even countries like India at the G20 are saying, look, this clearly is not working. And even the Indians, to my knowledge and my research, have sort of been ratcheting up the argument for reform because Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, in their neighborhood, a lot of countries are having this problem as well.
That's worth dwelling on for a moment. You raise a very good point. We're in a world where geopolitical tension is very high. और खास तौर पे अमेरिका और चाइना का रिसेंटली तो बहुत ही एस्केलेट किया जा रहा है कि टेक एक्सपोर्ट्स नहीं कर सकते और आप इन्वेस्टमेंट्स पे भी restrictions लगा रहे हैं into China. अच्छा, historically the G20 and the Paris Club in particular, which is a smaller group of major creditors, have been the main providers of capital to emerging markets. So this was one significant creditor block जो आपस में काम करके इन मसलों को हल कर सकते थे. लेकिन पिछले 15-20 सालों में चाइना ने बहुत लेंडिंग शुरू करी है to emerging markets, खास तौर पे to places like Africa in exchange for commodities, in exchange for infrastructure that they need. इनका जो बेल्ट एंड रोड प्रोजेक्ट है, that's absolutely enormous. पाकिस्तान में इसको सीपेक के नाम से जाना जाता है. तो these are enormous amounts of money that China has put out, and the US has been. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just on the shift that's happened, right? As you were pointing out, Pakistan is front and center to this shift. क्योंकि last time जब debt restructuring हुई थी, उस वक्त Paris Club के साथ हुई थी. Pakistan was an ally to the United States in the war on terror.
Correct.
Things moved very
Absolutely.
quickly क्योंकि you were considered a friend and a very important country for the occupation and the war in Afghanistan. America is no longer there. They're quite upset. And then, of course, in the interim, Pakistan has binged on Chinese debt through CPEC.
That's right.
Where 30% of Pakistan's external debt is now Chinese. So Pakistan is basically the basket case of these shifts that have happened globally. If you want to understand what all has happened in the last 20 years, all you need to do is look at Pakistan's debt profile and you'll get a sense of how things have shifted in the world.
और जिस रफ्तार से जैसे अभी IMF जो काम कर रहा है, to be honest, most people would agree that the IMF could have wrapped things up much sooner, like at least 2 months earlier. और मुझे तो हमेशा से ये लगता रहा है कि they're trying to kind of paint Pakistan as a poster child for what happens when you rely on the Chinese too much, frankly speaking. So you're absolutely right that that tension between China and the Paris Club creditors has been more and more prominent, and that's kind of slowed things down. The Paris Club people have been saying that China needs to participate more in the restructurings. China, for whatever reason, has just stayed quiet until recently when they put out a very scathing statement saying कि जी हम तो सब कुछ करने को तैयार हैं, लेकिन आप लोग properly इसमें participate करें. तो उसकी जो interpretation थी वो ये थी, basically वो कह रहे हैं कि जो multilateral banks हैं, World Bank, IMF, ADB, etc., they need to take losses. The Paris Club says कि वो losses नहीं ले सकते वरना permanently higher borrowing rates हो जाएंगे वगैरह वगैरह. It's quite complicated. But this was why also I thought the recent disbursement of capital by China, 1.5 billion and then the 700 million, this is very significant. Because now China, instead of sitting on the sidelines saying, "Okay, we'll keep the party going, we'll provide enough capital to keep these countries afloat," and they're calling the IMF's bluff. किसी के अब आप एक्चुअली आगे बढ़ेंगे यानी हमने जो करना था हम तो कर चुके हैं, अब आपका काम है कि आप ये एग्रीमेंट्स करें और डिस्बर्समेंट्स करवाएं, बाहर से और कैपिटल लाएं और इन कंट्रीज को आगे चलाएं. तो that's kind of what's happening. But
that's awesome in terms of the, I think that's a very good explainer. So people kind of get the full picture, right? I think it was important to spend a few minutes on this. Now, coming back to your point that we were at before the explainer, why is this not a panacea if you go into this process? Like, what does global evidence in your experience show about this not being the end all be all for a country like Pakistan?
So look, Pakistan is a country that has a fiscal deficit and will have a fiscal deficit for the foreseeable future. We will need to go back to these same creditors. अगर आप इनसे जाके अभी कहेंगे जी restructuring कर दें और हमारा debt काट दें और फिर 2 महीने बाद उनके पास वापस जाके जी हमें और $5 billion चाहिए, so it doesn't really solve your problem and it reduces your credibility. This is not the time to go for restructuring. This is the time to say, ठीक है जी, we take responsibility for the situation we're in. We are going to start enacting this reform agenda. We will not undercut it. We will stick to it. And then as soon as the crisis eases, and by the way, if you look at the numbers from the Ministry of Finance and the IMF, fiscal year 23 is probably the toughest period. This is the period when your current account deficit is at 4.7%. This is the period when inflation is peaking, etc., etc. इसके बाद जो है अगले साल से हालात कुछ बेहतर होना शुरू करते हैं. तो अगर आप क्राइसिस की हाइट पे जाके करेंगे तो यू हैव द वीकेस्ट पॉसिबल नेगोशिएटिंग पोजीशन. अगर आप 6 महीने रुके, साल रुके, कुछ अपने रिफॉर्म्स और इनैक्ट करके, और खसूसी जो सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट बात है, पॉलिटिकल स्टेबिलिटी के साथ आप उनसे जाके बात करें दी कि वी आर प्रिपेयर्ड टू कमिट टू अ मीडियम टर्म प्लान and we need your help in order to
you read
achieve
my
it.
mind there, Uzair, क्योंकि आपने जब कहा कि ये साल सबसे मुश्किल है और आगे आसानी है, that's assuming political stability, elections,
Absolutely.
and a cooling down of temperatures, right? So long as that does not happen, that's the big assumption here that people should remember and be aware of. That when I did the first season opener for this 3 months ago for 2023, that was the topic. Politics is going to dominate the economy. This is why. क्योंकि अगर आपका शोडाउन चलता रहेगा, लाहौर में इलेक्शंस होते हैं नहीं होते, लड़ाई झगड़ा वगैरह वगैरह, तो ये जो रिफॉर्म एजेंडा है उसकी जो क्रेडिबिलिटी है इस पे कोई बात नहीं करेगा क्योंकि अभी सबको कुछ पड़ी हुई है. बट दैट्स अ डिफरेंट conversation. We've had this many times on the podcast, but the assumption being political stability is very important. You can go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, Mr. Ismail Saab ne bhi यही कहा था कि you need these international creditors to have a credible counterparty to deal with. इसीलिए वो उनका कहना ये था कि उन्होंने snap and actions इसलिए नहीं किए थे कि the IMF would not have dealt with the caretaker government, which I completely agree with. So it's important that we have that political stability. I love the phrase that you used. You need to bring down the temperature. क्योंकि आजकल जो जिस तरीके से एक दूसरे से बात की जा रही है, you need some kind of unity. You need some kind of cooperation between the different parties to get anywhere. So that's quite important.
Yeah. So let's, help me understand this part then. One, agar debt restructuring process ki taraf Pakistan jata hai, this is not the right time to do it, but let's assume that, and I make this assumption because for the last 2 years, 3 years, maybe even longer, we've seen Pakistani policymakers choose suboptimal routes, right, in terms of managing the economy and the prospects of the people of Pakistan. So we'll work off the worst case scenario, which is even though we agree कि अभी जरूरत नहीं है वो उस तरफ चले जाते हैं इसका नियर
अच्छा सॉरी
Yeah, go ahead.
मैं आपकी बात काटूंगा सॉरी मैं एक बात कहना भूल गया था there is a very strong initiative the one that you referred to that the IMF is pushing now to discuss debt relief in a broader context right because all emerging markets are going through this अभी मैं MB जो emerging market bonds की index है उसकी देख रहा था triple C countries are paying 24% on average. So everybody is going through the same, whether it's Zambia, Ghana, etc., across the board, people are suffering. And the IMF and the creditor community understands this and they are trying to address it. तो एक चीज होती है कि आप वॉलंटरी आप खुद पहुंच जाए क्रेडिटर के पास कि जी मुझे डेट रिलीफ चाहिए दूसरी चीज ये है कि अगर आप 6 महीने साल तक इंतजार करेंगे तो थिंग्स आर कमिंग टू अहेड एनीवे एंड ए ब्रॉड डेट रिलीफ initiative is likely to happen anyway. जिस तरह DSSI हुआ था कोविड के दौरान उसी तरह इट्स क्वाइट पॉसिबल कि आपको वैसे ही अपॉर्चुनिटी मिल जाए एंड अगेन दैट विल पुट यू इन अ मच बेटर नेगोशिएटिंग पोजीशन to ensure a positive outcome. That was
especially if in the interim you sort of take the credible actions that sort
exactly.
of increase your leverage, right? Again,
Absolutely.
this is like we've seen this in the Asian financial crisis, the Latin American debt crisis, etc. People should read about it if they're interested in these topics. But again, assuming that they choose the suboptimal route, which I'm like becoming more and more of a cynic now कि वो करते ही हैं suboptimal route ही होता है एक आम शहरी पर let's say in the next year or so, what does that inflict, right? Because as you said, it takes a long time to get through this. Even the best case scenario is a few months of getting through that cycle.
Yeah.
For an ordinary citizen, when they hear the thing, oh, default ho raha hai, hum restructuring ki taraf jayenge, what should they keep top of mind of saying, what is going to be the impact on my life when that happens?
Inflation, headline inflation right now is 31%, core inflation is 20%. Expect that to stay there. It will not come lower. It may well go higher. जैसे तुर्की में जो है inflation has been hovering around 80 or 90% even without a default just because of poor policy. So it's not inconceivable that that would happen. There are plenty of other examples, Venezuela, Argentina, etc., where elevated inflation has just made people's lives miserable. तो आम इंसान जो है वो तो बिल्कुल अल्लाह माफ करे पिस जाएगा महंगाई की वजह से दूसरी बात ये कि आपकी क्योंकि एक्सटर्नल फाइनेंसिंग के मसले डिस्कस हो रहे होंगे इसलिए द लाइकलीहुड ऑफ अनइंटेंडेड कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस हैपेंस आपकी जो पेट्रोल की प्राइसेस हैं ऑलमोस्ट डेफिनेटली वो बढ़ेंगी आपका डॉलर जो है वो बढ़ेगा रुपए के अगेंस्ट तो रुपया जो है वीक होगा हर चीज की कीमत में इजाफा होगा और जो छोटी छोटी बातें जो जिनको प्रिडिक्ट नहीं किया जा सकता लेकिन मेरे ख्याल से लोड शेडिंग विल एट लीस्ट डबल एंड प्रोबेबली गो मच फर्दर देन दैट so
that's also just because Pakistan imports fuel. That's connected.
Imports a lot of fuel oil. तो हर किस्म का जो मसला अभी आप महसूस कर रहे हैं, it will only get worse. It will only get worse, and the unpredictability is what the real challenge is. आमतौर पे इन किस्म की situations में फिर crime भी बढ़ता है, security के मसले बढ़ते हैं. अब अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह 10 साल के बाद जो है पाकिस्तान की security के मसले more or less are they're on the right track at least. You have the Tehreek, the TTP guys creating problems here and there, but fundamentally, we seem to be in a better position than we were 10 or 15 years ago. So it's taking a step back, and then it's not clear if you sort of fall over and just keep going. Those are the challenges.
Yeah, I was actually, it's important you mentioned the TTP. I was talking to somebody who follows the security lens of this, right? And he was
Yeah,
asking me, and we keep in touch regularly about the economy side. And I was like, why are you so interested in that? He's like, Uzair, अगर तेल के पैसे नहीं होंगे और पहाड़ों में लड़ाई करनी है तो गाड़ियां और हेलीकॉप्टर और लॉजिस्टिक्स
yeah,
कैसे चलेगा फौज का,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
He's like, that's why I'm focused on the economy now because the TTP is getting stronger. It's not a
yeah, yeah,
unmanageable problem, but he's like, अगर पाकिस्तान default करता है या ये crisis होता है, as you explained it, then all bets are off because then the enemy knows that you yourself won't be able to mobilize your resources the way you could have earlier because you're out of money and out of fuel and out of imports and all of that stuff.
absolutely,
So I
absolutely.
think there's a security connect here as well that we need to pay attention to. Was there a final question on this?
Yeah,
We began our podcast with this topic as well. There are significant gaps in how the Ministry of Finance, the State Bank of Pakistan, how Pakistan as a whole communicates about its position on debt, its payment schedules.
yeah,
How does it manage debt? You're an expert. You've looked at countries around the world. What are some things that need to improve on the domestic side of the even the basic communication strategy? Forget
yeah,
and other topics that you have top of mind that need to be improvements to the way in which Pakistan deals with its debt. Less
yeah.
on the reform side, more on the management side. I'm talking
Sure,
about
sure.
to sort of make sure that we are not having this conversation कि यार पता नहीं 7 बिलियन है, 5 है, 6 है, एक दिन किसी
Yeah,
ने कुछ और कह दिया. It's
yeah,
confusion, right? That leads to
yeah,
uncertainty. What needs
yeah.
to improve here?
So look, I think there have been some important changes made since sort of 2018 in terms of managing the debt at the behest, by the way, of the World Bank and the IMF. पहले होता था एक debt coordination and policy office DCPO जिसका काम था basically इन चीजों को handle करना. 2018 से we've had what's known as a debt management office, which brings together two important functions, जो domestic debt है और जो external debt है, उन दोनों को साथ देखते हुए उनको manage करना और एक medium term debt strategy evolve करना, which kind of looks at basic or technical things like asset liability mismatch, what your profile of debt is going to be, how much of it is floating rate, how much of it is fixed rate, मुल्क की क्या vulnerabilities हैं from a debt perspective, and how you manage those and try and minimize those and create resilience. So, some work has been done there. I think a lot more work needs to be done there, and this is something that the IMF also noted in its eighth review. Okay, number one, you need the right personnel there. Just say, it's basically been run primarily on additional charges so far, the debt management office. I think you need somebody with experience in capital markets, with an
Additional charges,
understanding.
just in terms of jargon, so that people understand, is basically somebody
Yeah,
who's wearing two hats. If I get it
correct,
correctly.
correct. And I guess my point is basically you need a full-time technical person who's dedicated to doing this, particularly given the crisis that we're in right now. ये ऐसा काम नहीं है कि कोई lay person या कोई manager कर सके. You need lawyers. You need people with capital markets experience. You need people talking to the investors that we have around the world, not just the official and bilateral ones, but people trying to develop links with people like PIMCO, with Ashmore, with BlackRock, Apollo, etc. Big private sector creditors who could give you capital for specific things. So we need to do that. The second thing is the records management is, let's say, a little bit questionable. I've heard from multiple sources कि एक तो computerized नहीं हुआ हुआ, और दूसरी बात ये कि जो आपके 100 से ज़ायद loan agreements or commercial debt agreements हैं, they're not easily accessible in some computerized way where you can analyze them, when you can analyze the linkages between them, where you can look at particular scenarios such as the cross default one I mentioned previously. That's the big one in my mind. कि अगर एक फैसिलिटी में कोई मसला या उस पर पेमेंट मिस हो गई या कुछ हो गया तो बाकी फैसिलिटीज का
तो
क्या होगा.
यानी कि चैट GPT-4 जो है वो हम अपने AI टूल्स रन नहीं कर सकते डेट के ऊपर क्योंकि वो डिजिटाइज नहीं है.
That's it. अच्छा, एक चीज जो है वो ये कि the government has extended guarantees to state-owned entities and to particular projects in some cases, in order to make debt raising possible for them. So these are contingent liabilities that don't really kick in until something bad happens. And again, we need to be on top of those liabilities, and this is also highlighted by the IMF. Finally, there are a lot of new trends happening in debt markets globally. The one that everyone's heard about at this point is probably green bonds. which are bonds that are raised with the specific purpose of financing projects that are good for the environment or perhaps good for society or something like that. तो उसके लिए बहुत पैसा available हुआ था 4 5 6 साल पहले, and a lot of countries really went into that with a proper plan. तो हमने अपनी medium term strategy पे लिखा हुआ तो है कि ये करना है, हमने ये भी लिखा है कि gender bonds करेंगे और panda bonds करेंगे, लेकिन the kind of proactivity you need and the kind of market sensitivity you need, the sense of where the market is and what's supportable is actually quite important, and we need to develop that. So we need kind of a dedicated, strong, self-sufficient body that is not only able to analyze the trends in the market and think about how to raise money against those trends, but also able to analyze and maintain the current stack of liabilities that we have. एक और बात मैं कहूँगा जो मैं पहले कह रहे थे कि a lot of this information is not in the public domain, and you kind of hear about it when somebody gets interviewed. I think it's really important that the records for all of these are made publicly available and they're regularly updated. इसमें कोई शर्म की बात नहीं है और ना इसको छुपाने की कोई बात होनी चाहिए. These things need to be out in the open so that independent analysts, independent thinkers can look at it, analyze it, understand what's to come for the country. This is all part of growing up as an economy and opening up, which is really what a lot of the IMF program pertains to with respect to kind of like exchange rate rationalization, fiscal rationalization. These are all parts of becoming a functioning, well-to-do global economy.
Thank you. That's very important. And I think just as you were mentioning the ESG stuff, right? I was linking what we were talking about on the fuel side. Pakistan imports a lot of fuel and its energy is imported. Now, let's say in the next 6 months, the country develops a credible, robust plan to electrify mobility with, and says we need to develop world-class charging infrastructure, which obviously requires imports and we need to pay for it. But if that plan is robust and credible, where the global, automotive industry, charging industry, EV industry says, oh, Pakistan's about to do something big here, you could raise debt against that. And actually, that would be good 100%. Debt to raise for Pakistan to modernize its mobility, right? But if you just talk about it and maybe put out like a 5-page policy document and nothing really comes of it, then it's that much harder to raise debt for it, right? I'm just giving that example in the sense that लोग काफी दफा समझते हैं कि कर्जा लेना जो है वो एक गुनाह है. कर्जा लेना गुनाह नहीं है, उस कर्जे का गलत इस्तेमाल जो है वो आपको मसले में डालता है. And I think we need to have a more sophisticated conversation internally. And as you said, open up externally so that people understand what our strategy is, what our outlook is, what are we trying to do. And I think, again, it's very easy to have a conversation around debt and this crisis and just be like, everything's about to blow up. Well, crises are an opportunity, and I thank you, Uzair, for taking out the time and having this conversation about this crisis, that this is an opportunity to fix a lot of the 100%. Things that are wrong, to think long-term, to think about what are we, be very intentional about what are we trying to do, and perhaps have a more robust debate, right? If there is a debate that has to be had about people saying, like you, we don't need that restructuring right now, others saying we actually need it, that is a conversation that not only should happen in the public domain, but more importantly, should happen in parliament before a decision is made so that the people are aware. And I think we're not having that in the country. So thank you for adding to that discourse today. And I'll let you have the last word.
Thanks a lot, Uzair. No, I completely agree with you. I think that's a great point. All of this is moot if the conversation is only happening on YouTube. What we need is a functioning executive arm and a legislative arm that come together to solve these problems. The solutions are remarkably clear. I won't say they're easy, but they're remarkably clear. And what we need really is for the government to stick to its guns and understand that we need to take some short-term pain to ensure medium-term and long-term prosperity. हम जो हैं basically inactivity or inertia की वजह से इस loop में फंसे हुए हैं कि हम आगे नहीं बढ़ रहे, जबकि हमारे करीबी मुल्क जो हैं सारे, whether it's India, whether it's Bangladesh, not to mention the Asian tigers, are actually making rapid progress. So I think the steps for us to break out of this loop are quite clear. What we need is the political will and the sort of the policy space or the macro space to enact policy and make sure it gets implemented in order to fix things. It's not as scary as it looks. That would be my message to anyone watching.
Well, thank you again for taking out the time. This was wonderful. And again, for folks tuning in, do share your comments and let us know what you thought about this conversation. And again, as I said, the discourse needs to permeate into the mainstream, and perhaps this is a starting point. But again, look forward to speaking with you soon as this story develops, and keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Uzair. Enjoyed it.